Our presenter today is Seokmin Kim. He works at the University of Florida IFAS Invasion Science Research Institute. He oversees using literature-based assessment tools to evaluate evasion risk of non-native species that occur in the state, and new species proposed for introduction, and novel agricultural and horticultural selections, hybrids, and cultivars to see whether or not they're invasive or have potential to be invasive. His studies from around the world, and we do want to hear about this sometime, of how elephants spread seeds on their feet. He had worked in Africa and in other parts of the globe, studying dispersal, so very interesting background in his work with the Peace Corps, etc. But we're so glad you're here at the University of Florida now. Had done most of his graduate PhD work at the University of Miami, so has experience down in South Florida. But we're real glad to welcome Seokmin Kim to our Master Gardener webinar for on invasive plants. So I'm going to stop sharing and you can take it away.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Screen 2. All right. So you can just see the presentation on my notes, Wendy?
Yes, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and hide myself.
All right. Let's get things set up. Great. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today and listening to my talk about invasive species, the work I do with the IFAS assessment, and some things we can all do to better manage this problem. So thank you, Wendy, for your nice introduction, but I'll give you a quick background about myself anyway. So first of all, I'm an ecologist interested in managing human effects on ecosystems. As Wendy said, I received my PhD at the University of Miami, where I studied the ecology of plants and animals in the Caribbean and how they have been affected by people. I recently started working with the University of Florida as the postdoctoral associate and as the IFAS assessment coordinator, with Dr. Luke Flory pictured here as my boss. Finally, I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Fiji, so I really value the opportunity to engage directly with communities and stakeholders such as yourself, so truly honored to be here. But one thing I am not, however, is a Florida native or a gardener, so you all may have much better understanding of Florida plants than I do, but I'll do my best to explain invasive species and their ecology in general anyway. So today, I'll be taking you through the basic concepts of invasion ecology and then going into more detail about different management strategy and efforts with the focus on invasive plants. Since I only have 1 hour for this presentation, I won't be able to interact with you guys throughout this webinar, but I think you can send your questions directly to Wendy and then we can go over those at the end. However, I will be occasionally asking you questions through some multiple choice questions, so keep an eye out for those. So let's get started. So first, I will establish proper terminology and emphasize that not all non-native species are invasive. Next, I will explain the invasion process with some simple examples. Then I will discuss negative environmental, economic, and human health impacts of biological invasions. And then finally, I'll walk through the invasion curve and briefly discuss the work we do at the IFAS assessment, as well as go over some other invasive species lists. So here I present some definitions that adhere to the terminology developed by the Invasive Species Council, and I find it helpful to mention the synonyms as well. So the first is native species, or a species that occurs naturally in a specified geographic area. The second is non-native, which is a species that does not occur naturally in a specified geographic area. Now, this non-native species are also sometimes called exotic, but that terminology is being phased out, I believe. But regardless, expect to see both non-native and exotic being used interchangeably. So the third important term is established species, which is a non-native species that have self-sustaining and reproducing populations in a specified geographic area. Now, established species are also sometimes called naturalized, and I personally have used and seen that more commonly used, but naturalized, established, again, they mean kind of the same thing. And then finally, the big one is invasive species, which are harmful non-native species. Now, I discourage using any synonyms for invasive in general because there's been a lot of confusion with that. In particular, the term alien has been used before, but that has generally become phased out, at least in the United States. And I think I personally like that as well because when I personally think of alien, I think extraterrestrials or ETs. So I would just stick with invasive species for now. Now, one term that I have not used so far is a weed. So I want people to think for a little bit about what this could be, especially if you think this could be such a thing, if there could be such a thing as a native weed. All right, so we'll think for a little bit. All right, so this is the definition that I like. So wheat is a plant, whether it be native or non-native, that is not valued in a place where it is growing. So yes, you can have a native weed. Weeds are not necessarily invasive. And a good example of a native weed is the poison ivy, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. So with all that, it is very important to note that while all invasive and established species are non-native, not all non-native species are automatically invasive. So with that, we get to our first poll question of the day, Rebecca, and then we'll see where we go from there. So we should have gotten the poll there. Yes. What is the difference between invasive and non-native species? Starting off simple for now. All right, so it seems like most of you guys got it right. Yes, most of you guys got it right. Invasive species. So the correct answer was the third one. Invasive species are always harmful. So again, that's really important to know because again, the key definition that links all invasive species together is that they are non-native species that always cause harm. So there are many non-native species that are perfectly fine to use because they're never going to become invasive because they don't cause any harm. Okay? And I think somebody mentioned that I need to talk slower, so I'll try to be a little slower now.
I'm glad you saw that, and I'll tell you, they have asked you to do that, but one of the reasons is that they're creating captions. And
Oh, I see.
yeah, so it's helpful. Thank you.
All right, I'll talk a little slower. Oh, yeah. All right, so moving on. So here we have the invasion process, which is a process that all non-native species need to progress through before they become invasive and start having impacts. So therefore, not all introductions necessarily result in an invasion. And I'll try to go through each of these invasion process right now. So the first, we have transport. So here you can just see how interconnected we are globally. The light color lines illustrate flights, the blue are shipping routes, the green are global roads, and that is just for the ones that we're aware of. So now the pros and cons of globalization can be debated forever, but one effect that globalization has had is facilitating the transport of species around the world. So the pathways can be broken down into intentional and accidental. Intentional dispersal can be from horticultural and agricultural means, or even introduced as a means of controlling erosion or improving wildlife. So the kudzu vine, which we're very familiar with, is an excellent example of an intentional introduction gone wrong. So this was introduced in the early 1900s as a means of controlling erosion, and even as a forage plant before it became really out of control. So then we have accidental introduction. So the picture I have here is the emerald ash borer, which is known for devastating ash tree populations. So this species was transported in untreated wood, such as these wooden pallets shown here, which then led to infestations in new areas. So here we have a good example of how things are both transported and then finally introduced to new areas. So one thing we could have done to prevent the introduction of this emerald ash borer is to make sure that all wood products were better treated. then this species, even if it was transported, would never have become introduced in an area because by the time they actually got to here in the United States, they would have been dead. So let's talk about understanding our role as gardeners in this process. So 82 to 94% of invasive woody plants in the US has been linked to the ornamental plant trade, forestry, and agriculture. The example that I show here is the Callery pear. This was promoted widely as a street tree and for landscaping as an evergreen flowering pear. So while it was originally thought to be self-incompatible or unable to produce fertile seeds when self-pollinated, it turned out that they were able to actually produce viable seeds when cross-pollinated with different cultivars, and it has thus become super invasive. So the next step in this invasion process is establishment, or the ability of the plant to actually persist in an area. And perhaps the most important factor for this is climate matching. So here I have drawn lines on this map to show how much of the continental United States actually lines up with the rest of the world. So you see that much of the area in the southeast, and especially Florida, matches up with some of the most biodiverse regions in the world, and that is only when looking at the northern hemisphere. If you count the southern hemisphere, there's a whole bunch more. Then, here in the second map, we have a distribution of the mimosa tree. So while its native distribution ranges were initially from East to West Asia, it has since become established and sometimes invasive in the United States and Europe. So here you can really see how there are very few occurrences outside of its native climate range, just because they are not going to do super well there. So Florida's suitable climate and the abundant pathways are some of the major reasons why Florida is so susceptible to invasion. Yes, we already discussed how the climate is known to be similar to some of the most biodiverse regions in the world. However, Florida is also a huge tourism and trade hotspot. So the top photo that we see on the top right is from the port of Miami and illustrates just how much cargo actually sits on those ships. So one estimate says that 85%, so 85 of all non-native species moves through the ports of Florida. In addition, we have $80 billion of cargo arriving every year and an average of 120 million tourists visiting annually. So for these reasons, we have more than 1,400 non-native plant species recorded in Florida compared to about 2,400 native plants. So that is kind of, we show the combination of how the transport, introduction, and establishment with the favorable climates all forming together to make Florida a true invasive species hotspot, at least in the United States. So accessibility to resources is also important to establishment. So specialists like these koalas only feed on a limited number of sources, while generalists such as the feral pig here can eat all kinds of foods. And of these two, generalists tend to be the most successful invaders. So with plants, the analogy that I think of is specialist pollinators. And a good example of those are what happens with figs, which require specialized wasps to actually pollinate them. So like a common honeybee or whatever will never be able to pollinate and create fertile, viable seeds with some fig plants, but certain wasps can actually do them. So if those specialized pollinators and these wasps don't exist, then the plant is unlikely to become established, even if the climate is perfect. So therefore, plants with specialized pollinators are much less likely to become established. So moving on to the spread section. So next in the invasion process is the spread potential. So generally, many invasive plants exhibit common traits that help the invasion spread. So here, using plants as an example, plants that have a short reproduction cycle, high seed production, effective long distance seed dispersal, and the ability to disperse vegetatively, or in other words, being able to distribute using just their fragments, will tend to be much more adapted to spreading and ultimately becoming invasive. So a good example that I like to think of is like a plant like an avocado, where it only produces one big seed. It's much less likely to spread and become invasive than, say, the Brazilian pepper tree, which produces hundreds of fruits and seeds. So now the process has been explained, we pivot to explaining the negative impacts of biological invasions. Because again, to reiterate, invasive species, they're invasive because they have these negative impacts. So let's revisit So let's revisit the definition of invasive species now as a reminder. So invasive species is a species that is non-native to the ecosystem, is spreading, and whose presence causes or is likely to cause environmental or economic harm or harm to human health. So again, the last part about the harm is central to this definition, and I'll be going through some of these now. So the first and the one I think I personally work a lot with are ecosystem impacts. So these examples are plant specific, but generally invasive species harm native species through predation, habitat degradation, and competition for shared resources. So while I present this slide, I will try to give an example for each bullet. So the first is changes to nutrient cycling. A good example of this is the lead tree here in Florida. So this tree is a nitrogen-fixing woody plant that pulls in nitrogen from the atmosphere and converts them into ammonia and other related nitrogen compounds in the soil. Therefore, lead trees can grow in nitrogen-poor soils and also effectively change the nutrient cycling in an ecosystem through nitrogen addition. So other plants around the lead tree that may not do so well in high nitrogen soils will no longer be able to compete with them. So then we have altered disturbance regimes. This can be illustrated by this very intense and hot Melaleuca fire. So fire, as to ecologists, is critical to the survival of the pineland and prairie ecosystem in the Everglades. And naturally occurring fires have historically been ground fires that burn through low-growing grasses and bushes, but characteristically do not really reach the upper tree canopies. However, Melaleuca is a fire-adapted species. Its thick, spongy bark protects its inner layer from fire, while the papery outer layers serve as a ladder to shuttle flames into the canopy. Additionally, volatile oils in the foliage fuel intense crown fires. And although Melaleuca trees, because they're adapted to fires, can survive these intense crown fires, these fires often kill native and other endangered vegetation. So the next is increases in resource competition. And a good example of that I like is Lygodium, which can grow to overtop native vegetation as illustrated in this photo. This smothering growth habit allows the vine to access the incoming sunlight, while native species suffer a reduction in sunlight. So in this case, the Lygodium is outcompeting for both space as a resource and also sunlight. And again, all of these examples can ultimately result in a reduction of native species. So I have a few more examples of ecosystem effects. So the first photo is a lake heavily invaded by hydrilla. Meanwhile, the second is the same lake from the same spot after treatment. So as you can see, the hydrilla was all over the lake and one on the left photo, but on the right, they've been cleared and giving more room to native species. However, this is also a good opportunity to give you a sneak peek into the economic effects of invasion as well, as hydrilla severely impedes the movement of boats and other recreational activities. So the next thing is, next I transition to human health impacts of invasive species by looking at this example of the giant African land snail, really eye-catching here. So the giant African snail can grow to be the world's largest terrestrial mollusk. Its shell can reach more than 8 inches in length, and giant African snails have a voracious appetite, being able to consume over 500 different types of plants. So they rapidly devour fruits, vegetables, and ornamental plants, and pretty much anything else you can get their little mouths on. And this has been known to wipe out small farms overnight. And additionally, in places where the snails do not have enough calcium in the environment to build their shells, they've also been known to eat the walls off of houses and the paint off of cars. If that wasn't bad enough, additionally, the snails are also considered a public health threat, as their slime is home to the parasitic rat lungworm, which can cause meningitis. So some severe impacts to humans caused by these invasive species. So here, another good example of impacts to human health, except this time with plants, is the giant hogweed. So the giant hogweed is a large, tall, invasive plant, and thankfully not currently present in Florida, but has been established in other parts in the United States. But it is a dramatic example of human health impacts. So it is a garden ornamental originally from the Southwest Asia that is naturalizing in North America. However, they form these clear, watery saps, which contains toxins that can cause severe dermatitis or inflammation of the skin. Therefore, you can get some pretty severe burns if you can get sap on your skin, and the skin is then exposed to sunlight. And these symptoms can occur within 48 hours and consists of pretty painful blisters. Additionally, you can get some pretty gnarly purplish scars form that can last for several years afterwards. And meanwhile, of course, you don't want to get the sap on your eyes because that has been known to cause temporary or even permanent blindness. So here, I'm going to quickly show you some photos of how bad these things can be. So as you can see, these blisters are pretty bad. But because of how graphic those photos are, I'm going to we're back onto this much more pleasant photo. I'll go to our second question, Rebecca. So which of these are not common characteristics of an invasive plant?
While we're waiting, do you want to take a couple questions?
Sure.
Are you saying lychee?
Sorry?
Lychee? Were you saying lychee?
Oh, I was saying Lygodium.
Lygodium, the
Yeah, that was
fern.
earlier.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think I said lychee yet.
And what were you talking about? The change in the nutrient cycling? She didn't quite hear the tree.
The lead tree.
Which one is it?
Lead tree, Lead.
The
Let's
lead
see if I can
tree.
let's see if I can find the scientific name for that. I don't know if they're in Florida yet. Yeah, there's some of them are in Florida.
In South Florida, the lead tree. Okay.
Yeah.
And Becky's gonna talk to you guys about the enlarging of the presentation. I think has to do with your view, but she's gonna explain that to you. And
Perfect.
Anne wants to take you to task on the fig, Ficus carica, but let's save that for later.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've heard a little bit about that one. So
Yeah, I bet you have. All right.
yeah.
How's the poll going, everybody?
Great. Yeah, so I think you guys got it right. Not common characteristics. I try to be a little sneaky in there. So I mentioned before that plants that have specialist pollinators are less likely to become invasive plants. So most of you guys got it spot on. All right, let's move on. So now we're moving on to another major cost of invasions is economics. So let's start from there. So invasions have cost the United States $1.26 trillion dollars between 1960 and 2017. And much of that has included recreational, agricultural, and ecosystem services, with citrus greening alone resulting in the losses of $1.7 billion over 5 years. And of course, invasive species are also pretty expensive to manage, with it being estimated that invasive species management in Florida alone costs $43 million. And from the many invasive plants that we can see on the right, the ones highlighted here have been particularly bad. And notice how the most damaging plants is the hydrilla, which is number one, and then the water hyacinths, which are both aquatic plants. So non-native aquatic plants is something that the IFAS assessment takes a special look at, and we give them extra points to try to in kind of gauging if they can be invasive or not, just because historically non-native aquatic plants have been particularly bad, especially in Florida. So all put together, the United Nations report estimated that invasive species cost the global economy $423 billion per year. So now that is a lot of money, and I have a trouble visualizing how much that actually is. So I did a bit of digging around to figure out what we can do with that kind of money. So that money is more than the GDP of South Africa or Denmark, so pretty well developed countries. You could buy a new Lamborghini for everybody in the city of Seattle, or about 700,000 people. We could pretty much fix homelessness in the USA by building 1 million full-size houses. And $423 billion a year is nearly double the money that the United Nations estimates it would take to solve world hunger. So think about that for a second. If we fix the problem of invasive species today, we could literally solve world hunger almost twice over. So, what can we do to minimize such costs? So, to understand this, we can take a look at the invasion curve, which is a classic in our field. The x-axis is time since introduction. Meanwhile, the y-axis show the area invaded and the management cost. So once a species introduced, so at the far left, and as you move through time, the area invaded and the control costs increase. So if you can eradicate, or better yet, prevent potentially invasive species, the cost of management will be so much lower. And there's a strong correlation with diseases here. It is much better to prevent diseases through vaccinations or whatever than letting it get out of hand. And I'm sure we're all very well aware of what can happen if diseases get out of hand and how devastating and difficult to control that can be. So with that, how can we stay ahead of the curve? So let's go over some basic management strategies. The best, as mentioned previously, is by preventing things from getting here in the first place. A really good method for doing that is the noxious weed list, which is one effective means of prohibiting sales of potentially invasive plants. Then there is the early detection and rapid response strategy, or EDRR, where we aggressively target a recent invader. So some control methods from early detection and rapid response can be mechanical or mowing, chemical with herbicides, and biocontrol. And here we have some images of some of those control methods being done. But one that I find particularly interesting and encouraging is biocontrol, such as the one that are currently being used to control air potatoes. So these little beetles, which I circled, are beetles eat the leaves of the air potato vine and prevents it from reproducing and spreading farther. And what truly makes them super effective is that they only really target the invasive air potato vine. And because they're so host specific, I think they're much better in the long term than either mowing or using excessive amounts of herbicides, we can cause severe collateral damage to surrounding plants. So with all of this, assessing the potential risk of invasive plants is very important. After all, if we don't know what can be invasive, we cannot target and monitor them. So broadly speaking, risk can be assessed through two axes of this table here. So likelihood of establishment and impact. So following this table, the riskiest plants, which I've circled here, are those that have high impact as well as high likelihood of establishment. In contrast, a plant can have the most damaging effects in the world, but if they're unlikely to establish and live, let's say in Florida, then its relative risk is medium at best, again, for Florida. So these are very site specific. So some animal examples, since I find it easier to relate to animals. So iguanas, as we know, are pretty invasive in Florida, but they're not going to really pose a risk to other areas like Maine or Alaska. Meanwhile, the polar bear is one of the deadliest animals out there, but it really isn't well suited for Florida climates, so it is unlikely to establish and become invasive here. So with that, let's move on to the next poll question, Rebecca. All right, so according to the invasion curve, when is the best time for controlling invasive species? All right. So it seems like almost everybody got it right. So the best time to controlling invasive species at the beginning. So again, prevention is the best. And if that's not possible, try to eradicate them before they truly get out of hand. So very good. All right, let's move on. So in this context, The IFAS assessment is one of the many tools that we have to manage invasive species here in Florida. So the IFAS assessment has three main roles. So number one, evaluate the risk of species before it enters a state, such as the multiflora rose. Oh, sorry. Evaluate the status of species currently present in the such state, such as the hairy indigo plant. And then evaluate the invasion risk of cultivars or artificially modified plants, such as this Harvard dwarf. So the first tool I will show you is the predictive tool. As a reminder, this is used for plants that are not established in Florida yet. So this model is based on the Australian model, and we have modified questions related to the climate, precipitation, and soils to be more specific to Florida. Now, this tool has been tested for accuracy across multiple geographic areas and has been shown to be roughly 90% accurate at predicting major invaders. And with this tool, we have evaluated more than 200 species so far. A good success story with this is the beach vitex. My predecessor, Dr. De Laurence, evaluated this with the predictive tool and assessed it to be high invasion risk. She then worked with local and state officials to have this plant listed in the state noxious weed list, greatly reducing the chance that this species will become established and then become invasive in Florida. The questions in this assessment falls into two broad categories. So it looks at the plant's history and biogeography, as well as its life history and ecology. Each of these 49 questions then add up to a single score, which we then use to define invasion risk as shown here, with less than 1 being low risk, 1 to 6 being moderate risk, and greater than 6 being listed as high risk for invasion. However, all of this is a very complicated way of saying, 1, is a plant considered weedy at some place in the world? And 2, can this plant actually survive in Florida? Now, a key part that I helped develop are these climate suitability maps. The goal of these suitability maps are to determine if a plant in question can actually survive in Florida. These maps go along a gradient of suitability from high to low as determined by the shaded colors. So for this example, we see that this plant, which I think is the pagoda flower, is highly suitable for the southern and central regions of Florida, but not as well suited for the northern regions. Meanwhile, this plant will probably not even survive any further north, such as like North Carolina, Virginia, Maine, Alaska, etc. So compiling everything together, we then issue these conclusions. So here we are predicting what plants will become a problem in the future because they're not quite established here yet, with high, moderate, and low risk. So people in the field that can use it then can use these predictions to manage plants accordingly and try to prevent them from coming here. So second, we have the status assessment, which is used to determine which non-native species in our landscape is currently invading natural spaces. So think of it as kind of diagnosing the invasion. And much of the question we ask is very similar to the predictive tool that we talked about before. However, a key difference is that we complete the assessment with the help of experts in the field and land managers, scientists, gardeners, master gardeners, by asking them questions about the impacts of the plant, management efficacy, and the current ranges of the plant. So how well distributed and established are they actually? And of course, because Florida is such climatically varied, there may be differences in conclusion based on the state zone. And as I mentioned before, this can include testimony from master gardeners. So if you ever want to help out with this assessment, please let me know, and there will be a little sign-up sheet at the end. So kind of again, similar to the predictive tool, all red species cannot be recommended by university faculty or staff. Yellow or caution is okay to recommend, but you must indicate that it needs to be managed to prevent escape. So it needs some more management consideration. And meanwhile, green is go. So green means that this plant is fine to use. So these are currently not invading natural areas and are okay to recommend. And again, it is very important to note that you can have more than one conclusion for a species by zone. So for example, certain plants can become invasive and not recommended in the North Florida, but should be okay in South Florida, again, just because of how different the climates are. And finally, we have the Intra-Specific Taxon Protocol, or the ITP. So this tool predicts whether a cultivar, hybrid, or variety will become invasive. Um, These are used in the university's cultivar release process and broadly looks at if the variety or cultivar is distinct from the parent taxon and if it will behave differently. To make sure these cultivars don't become invasive, we ask horticulturalists to answer various questions. And now most of these are just to make sure that the plant is not invasive or can become invasive in the future. So if you ever see a plant or cultivar in your gardens, it is more likely than not, that it has actually gone through this whole process with our office before. So collaboration is key to all the work we do. Much of this is possible because local stakeholders and people in the field report potentially invasive plants to us. An example of the assessment kind of working is we had this plant coming called the Erharta erecta, or the panic veldgrass. A person working in Leon County by Tallahassee got a notification that someone had found this plant growing in the roadside. Then they contacted me to say like, hey, I heard a rumor that this plant was here. Can you do an assessment? So, and I estimated the invasion risk of the species, and lo and behold, this plant was found to be considered weedy and invasive in California and climatically suitable in northern and central Florida. So pretty much Tallahassee is right dab in the middle there. Thankfully, as far as I know, this case seems to be a false alarm. The person who was supposed to go check it out, they told me they'll let me know if this was positively confirmed. They didn't, so I'm guessing no news is good news. But as this example hopefully shows, with the partnership between the assessment and local stakeholders, we can control invasive species because now this grass is kind of on in our office's radar. So if this pops up again, we know immediately saying, hey, this thing needs to be eradicated and managed very quickly before it becomes problematic. So the IFAS assessment has this very handy website, and I'm going to spend the next few slides just kind of going over the basics of them. So you can click on each of these spots marked by the arrow here. So you can type in the species name, you can choose to view all assessments, or you can go to the top ribbon there. In addition to that, we have so then we try to make this website so that it's hopefully pretty intuitive. So one cool and handy feature of the website is this filtering system. This lets you sort our database by zones, conclusion type, and other characteristics. So if I'm only interested in plants in the central zone, I click on central, and then I could apply those filters to actually just take a look at the plants there. Additionally, we have this FAQ page at the top right, which gives you more information on how we actually do things. So once you select the profile, you'll get a page kind of like this one. So this is for the Sotus rotundifolia, or the pink lady. We assess this plant to be of high invasion risk for the south, but caution for central and north. And this had a lot to do with the climate suitability of the plant, which you also try to show here. So please note that, however, we don't have maps for all of these plants yet, but I am currently working on it. Next, going down, we can see some detailed data on the plant as well as some relevant links. So one of the things I actually want to add here is a section on native alternatives to these things, because one of my landmates told me, nobody likes being told what not to do if we do not give them a valid alternative. So while you're going through these, if you're checking these out, if you have an idea of a good native alternative, please let me know through this contact form that's on our website, or we can just chat about it more here as well. And again, this is a work in progress, but I'm here for at least the next couple of years, so I'm hoping to get that done before I leave. So before we go through the final set of slides, let's do the second to last poll. Rebecca? There we go. If a plant is invasive in Florida, it will always be invasive in other parts of the world. True or false? Perfect, very fast. 99% of you guys got it correctly. This is false because, again, as I mentioned, it's always context specific with a lot of these invasive plants. Like, again, the polar bear, it's going to be super dangerous up in the north, but if it's never going to survive in Florida, so it's always context specific. All right, so let's finish up with just talking about the different plant lists. So my predecessor, Dr. Dia Laurence and Dr. Lynn Geddes, helped write this article, which I'm sharing now, that does a good job at explaining the different types of plant lists that you will see throughout, Florida. And I'll try to go through some of the most important ones here. So the first sets of lists are these regulatory ones. So these are the ones such as the noxious weed list. There is both the federal and the state weed lists. Now, if you see a plant on this list, that means that it's legally prohibited to sell this plant, or even I think it's legally prohibited from selling this plant or growing them, with violators being fined. So regulatory, again, which is just the noxious weed list here, means that if you sell or grow these, you're going to get fined if you're caught. Then we have the two main non-regulatory lists, the IFAS assessment and the FISC, which was formerly known as FLEPC. This was formerly known as FLEPC, but they have rebranded themselves as FISC recently. So now these are mainly similar, but the FISC lists are a bit more comprehensive and are separated into two categories, with the first being category 1, being plants that actually alter communities by displacing native species, changing community structure or ecological function, or hybridizing with natives. And the second, or category 2, means that these plants have increased in abundance or frequency, but have not yet altered Florida plant communities to the extent shown by category 1. Then we have the IFAS assessment, which is me, that shows the most conservative risk-averse estimates of the invasion risk of plants. So sometimes people get these things confused, like just because something is listed as category 1 in the FISC invasive species list, and they say like, oh, how come it is not like listed as high invasion or invasive in, how is it listed different in the IFAS assessment? That is because there are different groups that form these. Now we communicate with each other, trying to make them as closely tied as possible, but there will be some differences. Okay, so before we finish off, I just have the take-home points left. Let's have one final poll question, Rebecca. Perfect. All right. Most of you guys got it right. So as I mentioned, I think I'll go back. So the IFAS assessment list, which is the one that I do, is non-regulatory. So the only ones that's regulatory means like there's some like legal backing to it are these noxious weed lists. So if you see or grow, so if you grow or sell plants on the noxious weed list, you will be fined if you're caught. But then these non-regulatory lists are kind of more advisory. So if you happen to be caught using so there's nothing legal that I can do. I cannot call the police on you if you're growing some high-risk invasion plants. I'll probably judge you a little bit, but you will not be fined. So only thing that actually has some legal backing to it is currently the noxious weed list. That doesn't mean you ignore us completely, because we try to be the best land stewards out there. All right. So some take-home points for this for my talk today. So first, I stressed that not all non-native species are invasive. And then I said that the species that can be introduced either intentionally or accidentally. Meanwhile, invasive species are only non-native species that can cause harm to the ecosystems and our economy, with it being that the longer it takes to identify an invader, that the more damage is done. Therefore, prevention, again, the first thing, prevention or eradication is the best time to actually best manage invasive species. Then I talked about how Florida's susceptibility to invasion is influenced by the climate and the tourism. Then I introduced the IFAS assessment that I'm in charge of as a resource to look at if a plant is invasive or not. Then I briefly went over the difference between the different plant lists in Florida, with the noxious weed list being the ones that have some legal backing to it, while the other ones, such as the IFAS assessment and the FISC plant list, being more advisory and kind of still something that you should look very closely at before you start planting them or whatever. So I've had some people come to me saying like, hey, how come you have listed this plant as high invasion risk in the IFAS assessment, but it's not on the noxious weed list? Well, then I say the noxious weed list has gone through additional processes and is much more specific to much more even tied to the economy and like the sale of these plants. While the IFAS assessment is the most risk-averse one that kind of tries to prevent as many plants from becoming invasive as possible. Okay, so with that, so I'd like to thank some of my funding sources and then open up to any questions. And then I had this QR code at the bottom right, which has where you can sign up to actually help with the status assessments. Because as a reminder, these are the assessments that I need to do for plants that are already established in Florida. So let's say you live in Tampa, and then you see a bunch of plants that you think is becoming super weedy, and if you can figure out the species, you can reach out to me if it's not already on the website, and then we can kind of collaborate on to see is like, okay, is this plant actually becoming behaving invasive or not? So I'll coordinate with Wendy and Rebecca to try to get the sign-up sheets sent out to you guys as well. It just has your name, your email, and then kind of where in Florida you live, so central, north, south. And then it has an additional thing about like if you have any plans that you have want me to take an extra look at. So you can either sign up with the QR code now, or I can send the sign-up sheet through Wendy and Rebecca later. So with that, I'll go back to the take-home points and take any questions.
Dr. Kim, thank you so much for allowing and asking us for the help with that. I really, really appreciate it. And I know that you will get a lot of takers. We've got some great questions here, and I'm gonna see if I can toss them to you the best way I can.
Yeah, I guess since the QR code is here, I should leave it here. There we go.
Yeah. So Jennifer Tong Martin asked, what are the most recent plants you've assessed as invasive? And you sent us a list at the middle of March. And
Yeah.
Jennifer, that was shared with your Master Gardener coordinator. And so you can check with them. But Dr. Kim, would you like to go ahead and just run down those 5 or 6 you just added?
Ooh, let me pull it up.
Okay. And
I don't have it in front of me at the moment.
that's okay.
There we go.
Dieffenbachia was one.
Yeah. All right, we have Passiflora quadriangulus. We have Chlorophytum comosum was considered a high invasion risk.
That's our regular spider plant. So we have Dieffenbachia spider plant and the large passion vine fruit, Grenadilla.
Yeah. Dieffenbachia seguine.
Mm-hmm.
And then Disodus rotundifolia, which was high invasion risk for the south, but caution for central and north.
And that's the pink lady, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I talked about that for my presentation.
You did. You had a picture of it. But Jennifer, check with your coordinator too. She should have got that list. And it's also in the Master Gardener newsletter that went out in the middle of the month. Okay. What about tropical milkweed, Asclepias curassavica? Nikki says it's listed as a species of concern, and is it up for reassessment?
So with the assessment, I'm checking it through now. It's the milkweed, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Asclepia. Yeah, so it has been done with the status assessment because again, it's in Florida. When was the last time it was assessed? So it was assessed in 2021. So with status, this is actually overdue for update because it has been 4 years. And I think it's already on my to-do list. But one
Okay.
of the issues we've had is just because, I just started in June of last year, so I did not have my predecessor's long list of contacts. Um, so I could not reach out to local managers to figure out if this is actually, how it's behaving or not. But now that I'm starting to have my create my own network and whatnot, I think I should be able to tackle this again.
Okay.
So thank you for
Well,
bringing that up.
there's a good question about, there are, here's one from Anne. Anne asks, how can nurseries be persuaded to discontinue selling invasive plants? And her examples are oyster plant and non-native firebush. Both of those are not invasive. Um, but we do walk into garden centers and see plants that are on your list listed as high risk of invasion. And is there any outreach to work with growers and nurserymen and retailers to maybe curtail this?
So I believe there is, but it's not something that the IFAS assessment itself is working with. But because someone had asked me this question before, it is definitely something I would like to try to do. Try to engage more with local nurseries and whatnot. Because one thing that I found and is that a lot of these nurseries, for the most part, they're not malicious. They're not trying to introduce invasive species out there just for the fun of it. A lot of them just don't know or don't care much about it. So I think an outreach thing would be very helpful. And additionally, another thing that I've seen is people like this happens a lot with in aquariums. So there has been an issue with the Vallisneria, which is the eelgrass. So they just don't know. Um, like they'll sell this eelgrass, then say like, "Oh, I did not know that this was going to be invasive." So there's been an ongoing effort to try to educate people like that. But to answer your question, that's not something that my office has been directly associated with, but that is something I would like to try to be more involved with.
Okay. Um, Anne is suggesting that on the assessment web page, on maybe on the front page, there's a tab for recently added and recently the on and off section, so you could see either added or removed plants.
Yes.
It's a good idea, huh?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Like a recent. Let me write that down. So
I won't let you
website.
forget that. Okay, Christine says, is the converse true? If something is invasive elsewhere, is it pretty likely to be invasive here in Florida if the climate is similar?
Yes, so that is something we definitely look at. So if something is considered invasive, let's say in parts of Australia where there is some climatic suitability to Florida, then more often than not, that plant is going to be considered high invasion risk in Florida as well. So the answer is yes. As long as the big thing, the two like big broad questions we ask is like, is something climatically suitable for Florida? And two, is it actually behaving weedy or invasive someplace else? So
Mhm.
both of those two combined means that it's likely to become invasive here as well.
Okay, somebody has asked the big number that you shared with us, the 400 and something million billion dollars. Was that just for plants or was that plants and animals?
That was for plants and animals,
Okay,
fungi, so it was everything, I believe.
okay, all right. And then someone is talking about the invasive lanternfly
Mhm.
wanting to come in. I think that might be out of your scope as it's an insect, or are you aware?
That is outside of my scope, but I do know a bit more about it. The lanternfly has gotten a lot of media attention because people say, "Oh, kill them all." But one of the students I actually interviewed recently, her professor works in Pennsylvania with lanternflies, and they say, "Oh, these lanternflies are actually not as bad as people say they are, but it is one of those things that are getting a lot of media attention." So like I don't know if you guys remember like the whole hubbub about the murder hornets back several years ago. So I think it's one of those cases where it just got like a lot of media attention. That's why it's being so well known. But in terms of how they're behaving ecologically or whatnot, that's outside of my expertise, unfortunately.
Okay, well, we will be having entomologists during the webinar series, so that's something we could pose to them. Um, and here's a question. I'm going to lump it together with the other one about figs. So we have Passiflora edulis is listed as high risk of invasion, yet it's being planted and studied and recommended by UF researchers. And then we could put the fig in there too. These are edible crops that are on the list, and yet we do promote them as alternate or plants that you can grow in an edible landscape. So how do we, strike a balance here? What are we doing about this?
So, so I think one with the fig that actually caught, I think it was one of the previous questions, was like, it didn't used to be a problem at all for the longest time because, again, it required this specialist pollinator. But then the specialist pollinator somehow got there, and that's how it became such a huge problem now with some of these fig species. But in terms of like the disconnect sometimes between our recommendations and kind of what you see like other University of Florida researchers saying like, oh, this is going to be okay to actually manage. The key thing is that sure we can say it's going to be high invasion risk, but that is only like it's going to be invasive if you. But a lot of these cases where they still promote some of these things is with this big caveat saying like these things need to be managed very properly. So one of the species that I'm actually working with now that has been some like conflict between like our assessment and then the rates they're being used is the pongum tree. And that tree has been like has some economic value, I think, for their oils and whatnot, but they have the potential to become super invasive.
And what was the
So
tree again? Hognut?
the pongum tree,
Pongum
yeah,
tree. So
yeah, so
yes.
yeah, so those so what the FWC has done is kind of work very closely with the plantations that actually plant these things to make sure they're actually being very properly managed. So even if like certain things can be highly invasive, if they have like certain economic benefits or whatever, as they really need to make sure they're being very closely monitored and managed. So pongum tree, I know there has been in St. Lucie, it has recently started being found in some rivers, but none of them thankfully has been tied to any of these plantations. It is instead just from poor people who haven't been taking good care of their landscapes. So it seems like the management strategy has been working, but it's definitely something we're looking more into.
Right. So there has been precedent to say this plant has high risk of invasion, but could be recommended with special management strategy.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so that I think maybe we'll see more of that in the future, but you can see how that could be confusing for master gardeners, right?
Yes, I agree. And I
Okay.
think the one of the things that me included, everything should do. Like if there's this kind of disconnect, we need to make sure to with the really big show a big highlight saying, hey, it's okay to use this, but do X, Y, Z, please.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Right. Someone's asking about the Mexican petunia, the Ruellia cultivar that's supposed to not spread by seed, but it spreads vigorously by underground rhizomes. Um, what's the latest on that?
I cannot give you any specifics on that plant. Unfortunately, I just haven't worked with it. But it's one of the things I mentioned. There's a tool called the Inver-specific taxon protocol, which looks at the cultivar spread. And one of the things that at least I've been stressing when I've been doing these with horticulturalists is like, sure, not being able to spread viable seed is good, but they also need to demonstrate that it's not going to spread vegetatively like the Ruellia you mentioned previously. So
Okay.
it is something that we're definitely looking up. But in terms of that plant specifically, I'm afraid I cannot give you too many updates just because I'm not sure.
Okay. Amy Stipe is asking about the FISC. When will there be a fresh FISC list out? Do you know? It's not easy to say FISC list.
Yeah, right. I think, first of all, I think there's too many acronyms out there. But in
Okay.
terms of when the next plant is, I've been invited to serve at the plant planning committee. I know there was a change in leadership with that, but I'm meeting with them next month.
Okay.
So hopefully soon after that. But
Okay.
Amy, I can
Okay.
reach out to you once I have more information.
Okay. Stay tuned on that. Amy
Yeah.
also wanted to talk about the prohibited moniker on on your website, on the IFAS
Yes.
assessment website. And is that the same as the prohibited for the Department of Ag and
It should be. So anything
okay.
that's on the state or federal noxious weed list, we automatically gets a prohibited
Yes.
thing on
Okay,
our
that
website.
makes sense. Um, and do you use Master Naturalist data?
Master naturalist.
I'm sorry,
I
we're iNaturalist, sorry.
So indirectly, so the two places I've used or used iNaturalist, I guess not indirectly, I have used them. So the first is when I'm doing the climate suitability mapping. So there's iNaturalist observations that are of high quality, so it has been confirmed. That gets uploaded to another database which contains the distribution data of a certain plant or animal or whatever. So those are one of the key data that I use to make the climate suitability mapping, the maps with the different shades of red that you saw. So that's one way I've been using the iNaturalist data. The other one is like I have used iNaturalist just to see for my status assessment for the plants that are already in Florida. I do kind of look at them and see like, okay, how widespread is this plant actually? And then for certain people who have or really enthused about iNaturalist, they post a lot of them. And then I've actually reached out to that person like, hey, will you be willing to help us out with this plant in particular?
Well,
Because
that's
I see
good.
that you're really interested in this. So I have
That's
been
good.
using those that way. But again, stuff with those citizen science stuff, I think they're great. But one of the things you need to watch out for is like make sure they're actually accurate. So that's something we have to
Accurate.
keep a really
Yep.
close eye on.
Yep. Yep. Um, and some someone says, and this is like if someone asks you what you do in an elevator, you probably say this, but
Yeah.
Susan asks, how do you know that a plant is invasive? And isn't it almost too late by the time you realize it? And I know you do the predictive tool, but sometimes the horse seems to be so far out of the barn already. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's definitely a tough one. Like there is some plants that I'm blanking on an example right now that we thought it was going to be not a problem in Florida, but like at the Ruellia maybe that's might be a decent one. Like where we thought like okay, this thing's not going to spread seeds, but oh no, we forgot about the vegetative spread, so it has become since very invasive. So just because we couldn't prevent or eradicate a plant and they've actually started to become invasive, sure it's going to become much more difficult, but that doesn't mean we can't manage them properly. So an example I can think of right now is like those water hyacinth or hydrilla plants. People are working on getting these biocontrol and like working on better, more targeted herbicide application to make sure they're more manageable and like not as spread as far. So just because something is invasive doesn't mean that we give up. One of the controversial suggestions that I've heard floating around in my field is like, oh, there's like this, invasive species and non-native introductions are inevitable. So let's just create this new kind of ecosystems. I'm like, no, 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 we're not. We haven't lost yet. There's still things we can do. As I said, stress many times, you can prevent them. And if not, there's ways of managing them that many smart people are working on. A very good success story, I think, and I think I mentioned it briefly, is with the air potato. Like we know it's super invasive or not, but the
Right.
biocontrol efforts have been phenomenal.
So
Like
we
sure, it's
have
still. Yeah, go
We
ahead.
have a couple questions on it.
Yeah.
One is, were the beetles,
Mhm.
Liliaceros chenii, look, I remembered,
Yeah.
were they bioengineered to eat, air potato?
So they were not bioengineered as far as I know.
No.
So instead, how this process usually goes, and I attended a whole seminar about this yesterday, is they look at where this plant is usually found outside of the world, like out in their native range. So they went there and then saw certain kind of insects that only really target this host plant. And there's a whole exhaustive, like multi-year process they have to go through to prove that this biocontrol, because that beetle is technically non-native, is not itself going to cause problems. So they go through exhaustive trials and many research to make sure that this is safe to use and it's only going to target that species. So as far as I know, I don't think I haven't heard anything about a bioengineered biocontrol.
No.
So yeah.
No, but they waited a long time to release. They made sure that it wasn't going to eat other plants in the same
Yeah,
family.
and a horror story of biocontrol that I've heard
I don't
is
know that we
the.
want to talk about that.
Oh,
Let's,
sorry.
somebody asked about the air potato beetles having lost their effects in Pinellas County due to climate change. Did you hear anything about that?
I haven't heard it directly, but I guess I'm not super surprised because a lot of these biocontrol have been like very suited for that. They have their own climate suitability. So if climate's changed, then maybe they may not be as effective. But I cannot comment exactly on um, how that has been or what they're
Okay.
doing about it.
And then here's a question about hogweed. Is there anything that controls hogweed in its native environment?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. Well, we are getting through the questions. You're doing so good. Um, and so this is the same question. Lantana is considered invasive, yet I see it at Lowe's, Home Depot, and other stores. They do sell a sterile variety, but this is hard. This is a hard pill for the master gardeners to swallow. We're teaching about these plants. We see the list of invasives. We see all the recommendations, and yet we go into our retail stores and people are able to buy them. So it's kind of hard.
Yeah, one thing that I've seen is like one of the questions that I ask and actually have been having issues with is like these online reviews, especially. Like one of the questions like, is it available online? It's like I can go on Amazon, type in half of the invasive species, I can see like you can buy them. So that's what I think like trying to put them on these more regulatory lists might be helpful with that. But in the comment about the Lowe's one, I wonder like if you take again, I wasn't there. I wouldn't be surprised if they're selling them, but I'm hoping that most of the ones that you see of the lantana variables are the sterile cultivars, not the actual parent plant. But I wasn't there, so
Yeah,
good thing to check
they
though.
they they should be. They should be.
Yeah, I hope so.
Uh, so here's a good question for you. Oh my goodness, this is such a hot seat, aren't you? Isn't your
Yeah,
chair burning?
no,
Is
okay, great.
Alachua County, where we live here in Gainesville, is Alachua County north or central as far as the map goes, or do we get to choose?
So the way that the north, central, south that has been, well, first I'll answer the question. We're north.
North.
And the way
Okay.
that has been defined is with the plant hardiness zones, which looks at the frost tolerance, the freezing temperatures of each of the areas. I think the technical term is like minimum annual temperature or something. So a lot of those are defined by that. So Alachua is north as far as that is concerned.
Okay. Very good. And let's see. Someone says, where do we ID the tree with black beads and red arrows? I mean, that you would bring a sample to your master gardener office and have the master gardeners identify that for you, Vicky. And if they were unable, you can send a picture or a sample to Mark Frank at the UF Herbarium.
Yeah, Mark's great.
And
You can also reach out to like your local extension offices too, and
sure.
they're pretty helpful.
And that's where the master gardener desk is at the
Yeah,
local
cool.
extension office. Yeah.
Fantastic.
How long does this evaluation process usually take you?
So from start to finish, for the predictive tool, it usually takes me about a day. If I was hustling, I could probably do like three every 2 days. With the status assessments, it's a bit trickier just because I need to coordinate with the local expert. So let's give it a couple of days for that. And then the ITP with the cultivars, that can take weeks because we have to go back and forth with the horticulturalist, set up a meeting and all that. But for the most of the stuff I do for a single plant, it usually takes me about a day to focus.
Okay, about a day. Now here's a really good question for master gardeners. How do you differentiate between home and landscape plants and outdoor container plants? Let's say for Sansevieria, they're growing the snake
Mhm.
plant in a pot around the pool. How is that as far as invasiveness goes?
So it depends on the plant. I believe for the Sansevieria, there's no risk of, again, I might be off on this, I'm not a Sansevieria expert. There's no risk of their seeds flying by wind or whatever. So one thing you need to really watch out for those kind of cases is the dispersal potential. So I'm making stuff up here, but like let's say I want to plant dandelions on a pot. That's a horrible idea because the seeds are still going to fly away. But if I'm just keeping I don't know, a sterile cactus, which I know is you're not going to flower, etc. That's perfectly fine. So it really depends on the plant and the dispersal ability. In general, I would caution that anything that can be potentially invasive, they should be grown, in a pot, like indoors, perhaps. Like a good example of that is the pothos, because grown indoors in a pot, it's fine. But if it's outside, heavens forbid, if like a part of it breaks off and washes away during a rainstorm, then that can grow to be a whole new plant. So keep an eye on the dispersal potential for each of these plants.
Oh, I think, yeah. Letting houseplants outside is one of the worst ways invasive plants have been spread in South Florida, for sure.
Definitely.
And let's see. Oh, so Vicky, yes, on the screen, that's earleaf acacia. That's up there.
Yeah.
The latest on blanket flower, if we're talking about Gaillardia, I don't know if it's been assessed. Have you assessed Gaillardia?
Uh, I personally haven't, but my predecessor has, may have. So I would check our website, and if it's not there, you can message me and I can do it.
All right. And so here's a good question. Master gardeners have demonstration gardens all across the state. And the question that Phyllis asked is, should we have invasive plants in our demonstration gardens that we manage? I don't know. I feel like they would need a really big sign and a warning sign, or
Yeah.
Dr. Kim, what would you say about that?
I would generally agree. I'll say like, there should be, if possible, not have them, but then like, in those like certain cases where it has been flagged as like it's okay to use under special management considerations, make sure to have like a big, you know, description about it. I say like this plant could be invasive if not managed properly. But you can have it growing in your garden under these certain conditions. So I'll have that, very highlighted in those cases.
Okay. And is there a biologic control for earleaf acacia? There is. We had a webinar
Yes.
about it, the January of 24. So if you want to go back and look in the webinar archives, you can find a great presentation on earleaf acacia. And
Yeah.
the passiflora that's invasive, the large granadilla, is that Passiflora ligularis?
Ooh, I'm not good with synonyms. The one that I looked at was the Passiflora quadrilinguis or something.
Quadra.
Uh, it's the shoot. Why can I not
I'm
remember right now?
sorry.
It's quadrangularis. Quadrangularis.
Quadrilaris. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was Grania or something. That's the common name.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's two questions. What's going on? Is there anything being done to stop the spread of Melaleuca? And is there anything being done to stop the spread of Brazilian pepper?
So yes, the short answer is yes. Both of those plants I've seen many times in like being high on people's list to manage more effectively, like whether it be figuring out what they actually are, understanding the dispersal potential, and then like getting biocontrol stuff tested. So again, I cannot comment on the specifics, but I know they're looking at better ways of managing them.
Okay, good. All right. Well, for a lot of you, I would suggest that you go to the assessment. Becky put that in the chat, and if you have specific questions about the plants, you can go ahead and do your own search. You should be pretty good at practicing in the IFAS assessment. That would be a great way to get some good practice in using that list.
Yeah, and then I would like to quickly add that, first of all, thank you for using the assessment, and then for all of those who's been sending me certain things to do, but especially thanks to people who have been like giving suggestions on how to make our website better, because we can always do better with these kind of stuff. So if you have any suggestions, I will welcome any of those through our email list as well.
Yeah, okay. So we answered most of the questions, but not all. But if folks have, if they would like to contact you directly, your email is on the website. So,
Yep.
but certainly check in with your extension agent as well and ask them the questions about invasive plants, because they should have the latest. And, but Dr. Kim is certainly here to help you, and he loves to talk to master gardeners. He knows that they are the a critical point with dealing with our Florida residents as far as invasive plants go. So thank you, Seokmin. We really, really appreciate you being here today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and happy to be here.
Okay, take care. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.